All right, today I'm going to review The Dream Machine by M. Mitchell Waldrop, no subtitle. So this book is a biography of an early computer researcher that was really active in like the 1960s and 70s, and he started a bunch of things that led to modern computers as we know them today. And the guy's name is Jcr Licklider. I don't expect most people will know about him, and if you do, you probably already pretty well versed on the history of computers. But this guy, he kind of worked behind the scenes, and he just happened to stumble into a career where he was given a lot of resources to fund research and development, and he just happened to have these really visionary ideas that turned out to be right on the money as far as where computers were going. So I'll give you a little background on this guy and kind of what his career was, because I don't think most people will really be too familiar with it. So this guy, he started off, he got a PhD from Harvard, I think in the late 50s or mid 50s. And his PhD was in psychoacoustics, which was this kind of precursor field to neuroscience and natural language processing and a lot of maybe biology and some stuff like that, but also computer science. It was this field that kind of bridged a biological understanding of the brain and then kind of this computational way of looking at intelligence and how thinking might occur at a very mathematical level. And later on, this field kind of split up and became a bunch of different things. But early on, that's what Licklider was focused on. But after he got his PhD and he started doing research and working, he got more and more into computers because he saw how useful they were, and he started to develop a bunch of ideas about what computers could become for people. And he ended up moving to MIT from Harvard, and then he worked in research and he kept developing his ideas, and then he just happened to get this job working for ARPA, which is the Advanced Research Projects Agency, which it was the U.S. government was trying to fund a bunch of research, mostly to support the Cold War, because it was the 60s. And one of the things they were trying to focus their research on was information processing. So they made this office called the IPTO, which is the Information Processing Techniques Office. And Jcr Licklider was hired to run that department. And he just happened to, and so when he got that job, he brought in all these fanciful ideas he had been culminating in his brain. And then he got this job, and he kind of set about funding research to drive money towards making this vision a reality. And after he left the office, he hired someone who thought a lot like him, and then that person hired someone that thought a lot like them when they left. And so his ideas ended up influencing a lot of the research money that was going into computers for a long time. And he had these three main ideas that kind of led to modern computing. So the first one was he had this vision for what he called man-computer symbiosis, which is a fancy way of saying interactive computing. Because when he got started with computers, they were these analog machines. They weren't even digital yet. Or I think when the story starts, it starts with analog computers. And they kind of use physical devices to mimic the math functions that the computers would emulate. And then they kind of added in all this digital technology over time. But these early computers took up huge rooms. They were these giant mainframes. And what the computer people would do is you would write a program by punching holes in this card. And then you take a big stack of cards to the office or the warehouse where they had the computer. And these technicians would feed the paper into the computer, and they would output a bunch of information, and then they would give whoever wrote the program back that information, and then they would go study the information to see what the results of their calculations were. And so it was this very long process, from input to output. It took a long time, and it was very tedious, and it wasn't interactive in any way. It was you submit your thing, and then you come back later and you get your output. But you couldn't use that you couldn't use the output that you got from the computer to quickly change your input and kind of have this back and forth with the computer. It was this very one-way communications system. But back in the day when that was going on, Licklider had this vision for interactive computing where you could just type something and then the computer would pop up the results, and then you could use that information to make a decision or input different data. Really like the kind of interactive computing that we know today. So that was the first thing he drove money towards, was coming up with programs and examples of this type of computing. The second big idea he had was for a computer utility. And this is the one idea where half of it was really good, but the way he thought it was going to happen was completely wrong. So he wanted everyone in the world to have access to a computer. But at the time, computers, like I said, they took up like a warehouse. So you couldn't just give people access to the machine. So the idea he had was that people could have remote terminals and they could log in to like a remote computer and they could like interactively use the big computer. Similar to like the way an electrical grid works, where it's like there are these giant plants that generate electricity, and then we use the electricity remotely. That's kind of the way Licklider thought that personal computing would come about. He didn't really foresee the shrinkage of computer sizes that would happen, and like the extent to which you could get a computer that would actually fit on a desk or inside someone's home, or be cheap enough to fit in the home. So he kind of missed that point, but he really saw the value in everyone in the world having a computer and using that computer in their own lives for whatever reason that they came up with. And then like the third idea kind of puts everything together, and it was this idea of a global computer network where everyone could communicate and share ideas and files and collaborate remotely from their computer terminal. And this is kind of where the ARPANET came from. This was like the idea that generated a lot of the funding that went into the ARPANET and kind of everything about that. And so that's kind of the story that the book tells, the story of how we go from analog computers to modern computers with the internet and personal computing, and we're all connected together, and using these interactive computers that resemble what we do today. He was kind of the guy that took it from one end to the other. And by taking this journey, the book really explains almost everything about how computers were developed. The book was extremely detailed, it was very technical, and it was very long, but despite that length and everything, it was always interesting, and it always kept my attention. And though it was technical, the book does a good job of explaining things as the book goes on. So you don't necessarily have to be very knowledgeable about computers, but I would say it would definitely help you understand a lot of what's being discussed in the book. So I really love this book. It's probably my favorite book on the history of computers. It definitely seems better to me than The Innovators by Walter Isaacson or Hackers by, I think it's Stephen Levy, but I'm not sure about that. Both of those books kind of target the same timeline, essentially. But this book really tells the story on a very detailed technical level, and you really understand like the evolution of the computer over time. It doesn't jump around. It really goes chronologically and follows all the threads from beginning to end. And it tells the full story of computers in a way that none of the other books I've read on this subject have done. So I really love this book. I would definitely recommend it to people if you're interested in the subject. But before you pick it up, there are a few things you should know. So the book, like I said, is very long, so it's going to take a long time to read. It's fairly technical. A lot of the innovations that happen are pretty technical innovations, and so you're going to have to try to understand these technical concepts in order to follow where the book goes. But the book does a good job of explaining the technical concepts, but there are a lot of them, so be prepared for that. And the third thing is that this book is very U.S.-centric. It really only covers the history of computing in the United States. Because Licklider worked for ARPA, which is a U.S. government agency, all the research he funded was really taking place in the U.S. And so you kind of get glimpses of what's going on in like Japan or Europe, but those areas aren't really covered at all in the book. But the book still tells a really complete story. It doesn't feel like they left anything out, but I imagine if I was from Japan or somewhere in Europe and I picked this book up and I knew a little bit about the history of computers in those continents or those countries, it would be probably a little disappointing because the book really doesn't cover anything outside of the United States at all. So be prepared for that. But again, I think this book was amazing. I really enjoyed it. And I really think anyone that's interested in how computers came about, how they were developed from these early analog things into these modern interactive computers that we know today, this is the book that's going to tell that story and tell it in a full and rich way that the other books don't. A lot of the other books just jump around and focus on a couple people or a couple products, a couple computers. This book tells the whole story, and it introduces all the main characters and kind of what their research was and how that added to the picture as a whole. It tells everything. So if that's what you want to know, or that's what you're interested in, definitely pick this book up, and you will definitely enjoy it. I think this is one of my favorite books I've read on computers in a while. Probably my favorite book on the history of computers. So yeah, if that's what you're interested in, pick it up and give it a read. So I've got more reviews coming soon, so like, subscribe, and I hope to see you guys in the next one.